Millionaire needs a fake wife for his brother's wedding. He's shocked at how beautiful she is. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. His name is Ethan Hale, a self-made millionaire who built a national logistics empire before he turned 35, a man used to solving problems with contracts, timelines, and clean exits, not feelings, not explanations, and definitely not weddings. The call comes in while Ethan is standing alone in his glass-walled office overlooking the river, the city stretched out like a blueprint beneath him, every street predictable, every outcome calculated, except this one. His mother's voice is calm but edged with expectation, reminding him that his younger brother's wedding is in 10 days, reminding him that the family will be there, the donors will be there, the old friends and the old judgments, and reminding him, pointedly, that everyone expects Ethan to arrive with a wife. Ethan closes his eyes, jaw tight, because there is no wife. There hasn't been one for years, not since he decided that attachments were liabilities and that love was inefficient. He says he will handle it, because that is what he always says, and the moment the call ends, he exhales slowly, realizing for the first time that money cannot buy time. 10 days is nothing. 10 days is a deadline. His assistant lists options he already knows will fail, introductions that come with expectations, dates that come with strings, appearances that cost more than they're worth. Then, by accident, by timing, by a coincidence that will later feel like fate, Ethan notices her. She is not dressed for boardrooms or ballrooms, just standing at the reception desk filling in paperwork for a temporary role, hair pulled back, posture straight, eyes focused, someone who looks like she's used to being underestimated and has learned to stand anyway. Her name is Claire Morgan. She speaks politely, confidently, without flirting, without fear, and something about that steadiness makes Ethan pause. He asks her into the conference room, not because he's sure, but because he's running out of options. He gets straight to the point, because that is his habit, because clarity is kinder than hesitation. He tells her he needs a wife for a wedding, that it is temporary, contractual, strictly defined, that he will compensate her generously, enough to solve whatever problem made her take a temp job in the first place. Claire listens without interrupting, hands folded, expression unreadable, and when he finishes, the silence stretches just long enough to make Ethan uncomfortable. She asks one question, not about money, not about dates or dresses, but about respect. She tells him she will not be paraded or humiliated, that she will not be treated like a secret or a joke, and that if he wants her to stand beside him in front of his family, he will have to stand beside her too. Ethan nods, surprised by his own agreement, surprised by the flicker of admiration he doesn't have time to analyze. He slides the contract across the table, clean lines, clear terms, 3 days, 1 role, no emotions. She reads every word. Then she signs. As she hands the pen back, Ethan realizes he has no idea what he's just set in motion. Only that for the first time in a long while, the solution he chose feels less like a transaction and more like a risk. Let us stay with Claire Morgan for a moment, because while Ethan Hale saw the contract as a solution, Claire saw it as a line she never thought she would cross. After she left the glass building that afternoon, the city felt louder, heavier, like it always did when she was carrying a decision she could not put down. She walked 3 blocks to her car, an old sedan with a cracked dashboard and a trunk that never quite closed right, and sat there without starting the engine, staring at the steering wheel until her hands stopped shaking. Claire was not reckless by nature. Every choice she made had weight because mistakes were expensive when you did not have a safety net. She had learned that early, after her father passed away, and the bills did not stop just because grief showed up. The hospital letters were still stacked on her kitchen counter, reminders that her mother's treatment was not optional, and not cheap, that insurance covered part of it, but never enough, and that the numbers never seemed to go down no matter how carefully Claire planned. The temporary job at Ethan's company was supposed to be a bridge, something to get her through the next few months while she looked for something stable, something that came with benefits and a future. It was never supposed to include pretending to be someone's wife. At home, Claire set her purse down and opened the envelope she had tucked inside, the one with the advance Ethan insisted on transferring immediately, just to show good faith. The number made her inhale sharply. It was more than she made in half a year, more than she had ever seen in her account at one time. Enough to cover the next round of treatments and keep the lights on without choosing which bill could wait. That was the part that scared her the most. Not the wedding, not the lies, but how easy it would be to let the money decide for her. She went to the window and looked out at the parking lot below, thinking about pride and survival and where the line between them really was. Claire told herself she was doing this with her eyes open, that she had set boundaries and demanded respect, that she was not being bought, only hired. Still, there was a quiet fear she did not name yet, the fear that stepping into Ethan's world would change the way people looked at her, including herself. That night, she received a message with a detailed itinerary, fittings, travel times, a reminder that the wedding was out of state and that the family expected them to arrive together. Claire read it twice, then once more, noting how efficient everything was, how neatly Ethan's life moved from one obligation to the next. She wondered if he ever felt cornered by his own success, if he ever woke up unsure of who he was without the titles and the money. The next morning, Claire stood in front of her closet, pulling out the only dress she owned that felt remotely appropriate, then laughing softly at herself. None of it would matter. In a few days, she would be wearing something chosen by stylists who did not know her and did not need to. She practiced saying Ethan's last name in the mirror, hearing how it sounded paired with hers, testing the lie on her tongue until it stopped feeling foreign. Before leaving for work, she checked her phone and saw a missed call from her mother, followed by a message that said she was feeling better today, that the new medication was helping, that Claire did not need to worry so much. Claire closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against the wall, letting the relief wash through her, followed by guilt for the secret she could not share. When she arrived at the office, Ethan was already waiting, reviewing details, calm and focused, treating the arrangement exactly as promised, like a professional agreement, no assumptions, no pressure. Claire appreciated that more than she expected. It made it easier to stand there and nod, to remind herself that this was temporary, that it had an end date, that when the wedding was over she would step back into her own life unchanged. What she did not know yet, what she could not plan for, was how standing beside Ethan Hale would quietly begin to challenge every careful rule she had built to keep her heart safe. The contract became real 2 days later in a quiet conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, where sunlight cut clean lines across the table like boundaries already drawn. Ethan sat at one end with a slim folder open in front of him, calm and precise, the same way he looked in board meetings and negotiations, while Claire sat opposite, hands resting in her lap, posture steady even though her pulse kept tapping at her ribs. He did not rush her. He walked through each clause slowly, explaining timelines, appearances, expectations, and compensation, making it clear that there would be no surprises, no last-minute demands, no shifting rules once they stepped into the role. 3 days in total: arrival, ceremony, and farewell brunch, after which the agreement would end cleanly, quietly, without loose threads. Claire listened, eyes moving from the paper to his face and back again, absorbing not just the words but the way he honored them. When he finished, she asked to add one condition of her own, her voice even but firm, stating that she would not be corrected or contradicted in public, that if she was to stand beside him as his wife, he would trust her judgment in front of his family, even if she said something unexpected. Ethan considered it for a moment, then nodded and had his legal team amend the language without argument. The sound of the printer felt louder than it should have, final in a way that made Claire's chest tighten. When she signed her name, she did it carefully, each letter deliberate, reminding herself that this was not a promise, only an agreement, temporary and defined. Afterward, the preparations moved fast, almost too fast to process. A car was arranged, fittings scheduled, travel booked, all of it handled with the smooth efficiency of a man used to eliminating friction. Claire found herself in a private suite downtown where a stylist measured her without comment, where dresses appeared and disappeared like options on a screen, and where mirrors reflected versions of herself she barely recognized. It was not the luxury that unsettled her, but the way people assumed she belonged there, how easily the world changed its tone when money entered the room. When she finally stepped into a simple ivory dress meant for the rehearsal dinner, nothing extravagant, nothing loud, Ethan looked up from his phone and froze, not because of the fabric or the cut, but because Claire stood differently, shoulders back, chin lifted, eyes clear, someone who carried herself with a quiet confidence that could not be bought or taught. He masked his reaction quickly, offering a polite nod and a practical comment about timing. But something had shifted, something neither of them named. That evening, they reviewed details together, practicing introductions, clarifying names, discussing the family dynamics she needed to know, the uncle who liked to test people, the aunt who smiled sweetly while judging silently, the brother whose wedding had triggered this entire arrangement. Claire asked questions that surprised Ethan, not about wealth or status, but about values, about who mattered to him and why, about what kind of man his brother was beyond the headlines. Ethan answered honestly, perhaps more than he intended, realizing too late that he had grown accustomed to people asking him what he did, not who he was. As the night wound down, he offered to drive her home, a small gesture that felt out of character and yet necessary. The ride was quiet, the city lights streaking past the windows, both of them aware of the line they were walking, professional but human, distant but not cold. Before she stepped out of the car, Claire turned to him and reminded him softly of the condition she had added, that whatever happened with his family, she would not accept being diminished to protect his image. Ethan met her gaze and gave a single nod, a promise without drama, and as she walked away, he stayed in the car longer than he needed to, watching her until she disappeared into the building, aware for the first time that the contract he believed would simplify his life had already begun to complicate it in ways he could not control. The trip to the wedding destination unfolded like a carefully staged transition between worlds, the private jet lifting them away from the city and into a quieter, more insulated reality where time seemed to slow just enough to make space for observation. Claire watched the clouds drift past the window, reminding herself that this was still temporary, still defined, even as the surroundings grew more unreal with every mile. When they landed, the estate came into view, sprawling across manicured acres, white stone framed by towering oaks and long gravel drives that hinted at generations of wealth and expectation. Staff greeted them by name, luggage disappearing before Claire could reach for it. And for a brief moment, she felt the familiar pull of self-doubt, the sense of being out of place in rooms designed for people who had never worried about rent or hospital bills. Ethan walked beside her, unhurried, aware of the attention they drew but not flaunting it, and without comment he adjusted his pace to match hers, a small gesture that grounded her more than words could have. Inside the main house, preparations were already underway, voices echoing through high ceilings, flowers lining corridors, and framed photographs of family milestones watching silently from the walls. Claire could feel eyes on her, curious, assessing, waiting for a misstep, and she straightened instinctively, recalling the condition she had placed in the contract and the promise Ethan had made to honor it. The transformation came just before the welcome dinner, when a stylist guided her into a room flooded with late afternoon light and handed her the final dress, not extravagant but perfectly tailored, the kind of elegance that did not need explanation. When Claire stepped out, Ethan was there, waiting, and this time he did not manage to hide the pause, the moment where calculation gave way to something unplanned. She did not look like someone playing a role. She looked like she belonged, not because of the dress or the setting, but because she carried herself with a quiet certainty that commanded space. He cleared his throat, offered his arm, and for the first time the gesture felt less like rehearsal and more like instinct. As they entered the gathering together, conversation softened, then resumed with a different tone, and introductions followed, names exchanged, smiles measured. Ethan's mother studied Claire closely, searching for cracks, while others tested boundaries with polite questions disguised as compliments. Claire answered calmly, choosing her words with care but not caution, sharing just enough to be genuine without revealing the private reasons that had brought her here. When one relative made a pointed remark about how quickly Ethan had settled down, Claire met it with grace, speaking warmly about timing and choice, about how life rarely followed a straight line, and the response drew a ripple of approval that surprised more than one person in the room. Ethan watched from her side, increasingly aware that she was not simply keeping up, she was setting the tone. Later, during a quiet moment on the terrace, he asked her if she was all right, expecting a polite answer. But she surprised him again by telling the truth, admitting that it was overwhelming but manageable, that she was not afraid of scrutiny as long as she was treated honestly. The admission lingered between them, honest and unadorned, and Ethan found himself reflecting on how rarely anyone spoke to him without an agenda. As the evening drew to a close, laughter floated through the open doors, and the weight of expectation settled more comfortably than he had anticipated. Claire excused herself to step inside, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts, realizing that the shock he had felt earlier was not about beauty at all, but about presence, about the unexpected strength of the woman standing beside him, and about the quiet realization that what was supposed to be a simple arrangement was beginning to feel dangerously real. The wedding day arrived with a crisp morning breeze that carried the scent of fresh flowers across the estate, and by the time guests began to gather, the atmosphere had shifted from polite curiosity to open evaluation. This was the day everyone had been waiting for, the moment when appearances would be measured and judgments quietly finalized. Claire stood beside Ethan in a sunlit room just off the main hall, listening to the distant murmur of voices, feeling the weight of the role settle fully onto her shoulders. She reminded herself to breathe, to stay present, to remember that she was here by choice, not accident. When they stepped outside together, the scene unfolded like a picture from a magazine. White chairs aligned perfectly, soft music drifting through the air, and faces turning toward them with interest that bordered on scrutiny. The weekend ended. Each time, Claire responded with grace, never defensive, never apologetic, asserting her presence without arrogance. The real test came during a toast when a family friend joked about Ethan finally settling down and hinted that everyone hoped this phase would last longer than his previous distractions. Laughter followed, uneven and uncomfortable. For a heartbeat, all eyes turned to Claire, waiting to see if she would smile and absorb the insult quietly. Instead, she raised her glass and spoke, not to correct, but to reframe, thanking everyone for their welcome, acknowledging how intimidating it could be to step into a family with such history, and expressing gratitude for the chance to stand beside Ethan during an important moment in his brother's life. Her words were sincere, measured, and disarming, and when she finished, the applause that followed was genuine. Ethan watched her, a slow realization settling in as he understood that she was not surviving the test. She was passing it with quiet authority. Later, away from the crowd, he told her she had handled everything perfectly, expecting her to deflect the praise, but she simply nodded and said she had only spoken the truth. That honesty struck him harder than any performance could have. As the night wore on and the music softened, Ethan found himself looking at Claire differently, no longer as a solution or a role, but as a woman who had walked into a room full of judgment and stood her ground without needing his protection. And in that realization, something shifted irrevocably, because the public test he believed was meant for her had revealed far more about him, and about how unprepared he was for the feelings beginning to take shape beneath the contract they both pretended was still in control. The celebration slowly thinned as the night deepened, laughter fading into softer conversations and music drifting into the background like a distant echo. And when Claire finally stepped away from the crowd, it was not out of exhaustion but necessity, the need for a quiet moment where she could breathe without being watched. She found her way to a small garden path behind the main house, the gravel cool beneath her shoes, the air carrying the faint scent of jasmine and night dew. For the first time all day, she let her shoulders relax, releasing the tension she had held so carefully in place. Moments later, she heard footsteps and turned to see Ethan approaching, his jacket draped over one arm, his expression no longer the composed mask he wore so easily in public. He stopped a few feet away, as if unsure whether he was allowed to cross the distance, and asked if she was all right. Claire considered giving him the polite answer she had perfected, the one that kept things simple, but something about the quiet made it feel unnecessary. She told him the truth, that the day had been harder than she expected, not because of the people or the comments, but because pretending to belong required a kind of constant vigilance that left little room to simply exist. Ethan listened without interrupting, hands clasped loosely, eyes focused on her in a way that felt attentive rather than analytical. He admitted, after a pause, that watching her navigate his family had unsettled him, not because she faltered, but because she did not, because she handled situations he had spent years avoiding with a grace he could not teach or replicate. Claire looked at him then, really looked, noticing the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, the weight he carried even when standing still. She asked him why he never talked about himself, why everything in his life seemed arranged to keep people at a distance. The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he almost deflected, but the quiet held him in place. He told her about the years it took to build his company, about learning early that control was safety and that emotions were variables he could not afford. He spoke about relationships that felt transactional even when they were not meant to be, about the loneliness that came with being admired more for what he owned than who he was. Claire listened now, offering no judgment, only understanding, and shared pieces of her own story in return, about growing up learning to adapt, about the constant calculations required to stay afloat, about loving someone enough to put their needs ahead of your own comfort. Their words moved easily between them, unguarded, and in that exchange, the contract that had defined their connection began to feel strangely irrelevant. Ethan admitted that he had expected the weekend to be a performance, something to endure and conclude, but that being with her had disrupted that expectation, forcing him to confront feelings he had not planned for and did not know how to manage. Claire acknowledged the shift too, careful not to let it turn into something heavier than it could bear, reminding him softly that the agreement still existed, that lines were there for a reason. Ethan nodded, accepting the boundary even as he struggled with it, and offered his jacket against the evening chill, a simple gesture that carried no agenda. She accepted, surprised by how natural it felt, and they stood together for a moment in silence, the distant lights of the estate glowing behind them. When they eventually walked back toward the house, there was no dramatic declaration, no crossing of lines, only a quiet awareness that something fundamental had changed, that beneath the formality and the rules, a connection had taken root, fragile but undeniable, and that whatever lay ahead would demand more honesty than either of them had anticipated when they first signed the contract that was now beginning to loosen its hold. The morning after the wedding carried a different energy, quieter on the surface but charged beneath it, as if the estate itself sensed the shift that was coming. Guests lingered over breakfast, conversations low and deliberate, glances exchanged that suggested stories were already forming. Claire felt it before it happened, the subtle tightening in her chest as she walked through the garden toward the main house, Ethan beside her, both of them aware that the weekend was nearing its end and that the fragile balance they had built could not last untouched. It began with a message Ethan received on his phone, his expression changing as he read it, the controlled calm he wore so well slipping just enough for Claire to notice. A family friend, someone with access and curiosity in equal measure, had found something that was never meant to leave the conference room, a copy of the agreement drafted for legal clarity and never intended for public eyes. The knowledge spread quickly, not with confrontation, but with whispers, the most dangerous kind of revelation in a family that valued image above all else. Claire first sensed it during a conversation that abruptly stalled when she approached, the polite smiles freezing just a fraction too long, the warmth draining from voices that had praised her only hours before. She did not need confirmation to understand what had happened. The truth arrived fully formed, heavy and unavoidable. When Ethan finally told her, his voice was low and tight, the words measured but the guilt unmistakable. Claire felt a wave of emotion that surprised her in its intensity, not shock, but a deep, quiet hurt. She had agreed to the contract with clear eyes, but she had trusted him to protect her from exactly this kind of exposure, from being reduced to a line item in someone else's narrative. The confrontation came soon after, drawn into the open by Ethan's mother, who requested a private conversation that quickly became anything but. The questions were sharp, disappointment layered with anger, accusations framed as concern, all centered on deception and embarrassment. Claire stood there, feeling the weight of every gaze, every judgment that now saw her not as a woman, but as evidence of a mistake. Ethan listened for a moment longer than he should have, torn between the instinct to smooth things over and the promise he had made. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the tension, firm and unmistakable, taking responsibility without deflection, acknowledging the contract and the reasons behind it, but refusing to allow Claire to be portrayed as a schemer or a shameful secret. The room fell silent, stunned by his refusal to retreat. Claire watched him then, truly seeing the cost of the choice he was making, the fracture it would cause in relationships he had spent his life managing carefully. When the conversation ended, unresolved and raw, Claire excused herself, stepping away before emotion could override dignity. She returned to the guest room, closing the doors softly behind her, the silence pressing in as reality settled. This was the moment the agreement had anticipated, the point where everything unraveled, and yet nothing about it felt clean or simple. Ethan came to her later, his apology immediate and sincere, offering solutions, distance, whatever she needed to protect herself from further harm. Claire listened, then surprised him by shaking her head, telling him that the hurt was not in the exposure, but in the realization of how easily people discarded what they had praised once it no longer suited them. She told him she did not regret agreeing to the arrangement, nor did she regret the connection that had formed, but she would not stay where she was unwelcome or treated as expendable. The words landed with quiet finality. As she began to pack, Ethan stood in the doorway, faced with a truth he could not negotiate away, that this was no longer about appearances or damage control, but about who he was willing to stand up for when it mattered most. And in that moment, with the contract effectively torn apart by circumstance, the choice before him was clearer and more frightening than any he had faced in business, because this one could not be solved with money or influence, only with courage. The reckoning came sooner than Ethan expected, not in a quiet hallway or behind closed doors, but in the wide open space of the farewell luncheon where family, donors, and longtime friends gathered to close the weekend with smiles that now felt rehearsed. Claire had finished packing, her suitcase resting by the door, her decision steady even as her chest ached, when a message arrived asking both of them to join the gathering one last time. She hesitated, then went, not because she owed anyone an explanation, but because she refused to leave as something whispered about and diminished. When they entered together, the room stilled, conversations tapering off as eyes turned toward them, curiosity sharpened by the knowledge that something had broken. Ethan felt it too, the familiar pressure to manage, to smooth, to protect the image that had always come first, and for a brief moment the old instinct urged him to keep things contained. Then he saw Claire's expression, composed but resolute, and understood that containment was no longer an option. Before anyone could frame the narrative for them, Ethan asked for the room's attention, his voice carrying without force, steady in a way that surprised even him. He acknowledged the truth directly, that the marriage had begun as an agreement, a decision he made out of fear of judgment and obligation rather than honesty. A murmur rippled through the room, shock mixing with satisfaction for those who felt vindicated. He did not stop there. He spoke about responsibility, about how the choice had been his alone, and about how Claire had entered the arrangement with transparency and dignity, setting boundaries he had promised to respect. He made it clear that any attempt to paint her as manipulative or opportunistic was not only wrong, but a reflection of the very values he was no longer willing to uphold. Claire listened, heart pounding, as the weight of his words shifted the room's energy, admiration flickering where disdain had been moments before. Ethan went further, admitting that what he had not planned for was the way the agreement revealed his own shortcomings, how standing beside Claire had shown him the difference between performing a role and choosing a person. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed the folded contract, holding it up long enough for its significance to register, then tore it cleanly in half, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He said that whatever judgment followed would be his to carry, but that he would not allow Claire to be collateral damage in a story he had authored. Silence settled, heavy and undeniable. Claire felt tears threaten but held them back, grounded by the strength of the moment, by the knowledge that this was not a gesture meant to win her back, but a choice made publicly, without guarantee. When Ethan turned to her, his gaze was open, vulnerable in a way she had not seen before, and he told her she was free to leave, free to walk away without explanation or obligation, but that he hoped she would know how deeply she had changed him. Claire took a breath, feeling the eyes of the room and the pull of her own emotions, and spoke softly but clearly, thanking him for the honesty and for standing up when it mattered, even if it came late. She said that she would leave, not in anger, but with respect for herself and for what they had shared, because real choices required space to be made freely. The room seemed to exhale as she finished, the tension easing into something like understanding. As she turned to go, Ethan did not stop her, honoring the boundary she had drawn, even as every instinct urged him to hold on. What neither of them could fully grasp yet was that the choice made in that moment, to put truth above convenience and courage above control, had already rewritten the terms of their connection, leaving behind the wreckage of a contract and opening the door to something unprotected, uncertain, and real. Time did what neither of them could do in the moment. It softened the sharpest edges without erasing the truth of what had happened, and in the weeks that followed, life resumed its ordinary rhythm for Claire Morgan in ways that felt both grounding and strange. She returned to her routine: early mornings, careful budgeting, hospital visits with her mother where small improvements felt like quiet victories, and a new job offer that came not from influence, but from her own steady competence. The money from the agreement had been returned, untouched beyond what had already been spent on necessities, a decision she made without announcement because it mattered to her to close that chapter cleanly. Ethan Hale watched all of this from a distance he forced himself to respect, resisting the urge to intervene, to fix, to smooth over the discomfort his choices had created. For the first time in his life, he did not use resources to manage the aftermath of a mistake, choosing instead to sit with it, to let the consequences teach him something he had avoided for years. He restructured obligations, declined invitations that no longer aligned with his values, and surprised his own team by prioritizing transparency over optics, a shift that felt unsettling and necessary all at once. Months later, on an ordinary afternoon marked by clear skies and a mild breeze, Claire received a message asking if she would meet Ethan for coffee, not to explain or revisit the past, but simply to talk. She agreed, cautiously, meeting him at a small cafe near the river, far from boardrooms and estates, where no one expected anything of them. Ethan arrived alone, dressed simply, no entourage, no agenda, and when they sat across from each other, the space between them felt honest. He thanked her, not for what she had done for his family, but for what she had shown him about courage and choice, and he apologized again, not out of habit, but with an understanding that felt earned. Claire listened, recognizing the change not in his words, but in his willingness to let silence exist without rushing to fill it. They spoke of their lives as they were now, not as roles or expectations, and when the conversation ended, there was no pressure, only a shared acknowledgement that something unfinished remained. Weeks passed before Ethan reached out again, this time asking Claire to join him for a walk at the same garden path behind the estate, now quiet and unadorned, a place stripped of ceremony. She went, curious rather than guarded, and found him waiting with no speech prepared, only honesty. He told her that the wedding had been fake, the contract a mistake born of fear, but that what followed was real, the respect, the admiration, the connection that grew when he stopped hiding behind control. He asked her, without spectacle, without guarantees, if she would consider choosing him freely, not as a solution, not as a role, but as a partner willing to learn and stand openly. Claire took her time before answering, feeling the weight of the choice and the freedom within it, then said yes, not because everything was resolved, but because trust had been rebuilt where it mattered most. There was no ring yet, no grand announcement, only a promise to move forward deliberately. Months later, surrounded by a small circle of friends and family who had earned their place, Ethan asked her again, this time with a simple ring and a question that needed no contract to bind it. Claire said yes, smiling through tears that felt earned, and as they stood together, the past no longer a shadow but a foundation, it became clear that what began as a performance had transformed into a commitment rooted in choice. The wedding that followed was modest and sincere, a reflection of who they had become, and when Ethan looked at Claire, he understood fully that the shock he once felt had nothing to do with beauty, and everything to do with the courage to stand beside someone. not because you need them to complete an image, but because you choose them to share a life.